All right. So thanks again, everyone. This is a CAS UDX webinar. I'm happy to present Steve Van Tuyl and Elle O'Brien. They're both our speakers today who are presenting on research that they conducted. Not sure if you noticed a bunch of surveys going around this summer, but I was really intrigued to find out what results were. And so Steve and Elle, who both conducted some of these, graciously accepted this invitation to speak with us. Steve is a program manager for Academic Data Science Alliance. He's going to speak about the impacts of generative AI on the RSE workplace. And Elle is a researcher and lecturer at the University of Michigan School of Information. She's also the director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science's graduate certificate program. And she'll speak to us about how scientists are adopting AI coding tools. Steve is going to be up first, and he'll have some time for questions until about the bottom of the hour when Elle will present. And we'll have time for more questions at the end as well. Feel free to type questions into the chat and I'll monitor that and bring them up at the end if you don't want to forget them as well. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and Steve, you can take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you. If I can I do it right? The answer seems to be maybe.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, now it's like in full screen mode and everybody's excited. Okay,
Yes.
so yeah, thanks for the introduction and the invitation. I'm excited to be here to speak on this topic and with Elle, who's been doing some awesome work also. Uh, and like we were talking about earlier, these works are pretty complementary, so it'll be fun to hear them together. So yeah, I'm Steve Van Tuyl. I'm a program manager with, this is a slight discrepancy. We've just changed our name from the Academic Data Science Alliance to the Alliance for Data Science and AI. Um, it's topical, that change, right? So a lot of people are adding AI to their names, and so we have done the same because I think it reflects the work we're doing. But the work we're going to talk about here today is about the state of AI in the research software engineer workplace. And just from the top, we're specifically talking here about generative AI and this new kind of like flurry of tools that have emerged over the last couple of years. Of course, there's other AI use and implementation among research software engineers, but that's not really what we're referring to here. Okay, so just for a little bit of background, you may have noted that there's a little bit of hype about AI out there. Um, so we've got a list of some delightful news research results here on the right side. As you may have seen, most of the hype is pretty unspecific. It's very speculative and it's often quite dystopian, right? So we have this kind of like doom, doom and gloom view of how AI may affect the workplace, and specifically when we think about software engineering and research software engineering. Um, but because all of this work that we have out there that's already been done about kind of, what's the impact of AI going to be, because it's all very general, what we don't have really is a good sense for the state of affairs in the research software engineering workspace. So how are RSEs using AI? How's that going? What's working, what's not, and so on. And so that was kind of the goal of this project, is to quickly take the temperature of the community of research software engineers and look for opportunities to build out some sort of support networks or resources for the RSE community to help kind of navigate these um, choppy waters as we work through the AI workspace right now. So this project is a collaboration between the Alliance for Data Science and AI and the US Research Software Engineer Association. We've been working with Sandra Gessing from US-RSE. And then we're funded by and supported by the folks at Schmidt Sciences, which is a philanthropic scientific organization. So Arfon Smith is the person that we're working with there at Schmidt. So we came together, the three groups of us, to make this attempt to take a quick temperature of the space of AI in the RSE workplace. So I think the first thing that we ought to do maybe, Elle may have some different definitions here, but it's probably a good idea just to define what a research software engineer is. I've got two definitions here. They're pretty complementary. The first one comes from the US Research Software Engineer Association. So RSEs are those who regularly use expertise in programming to advance research. And then from our partner organization over in the UK, a definition, one who combines professional software engineering expertise with an intimate understanding of research, right? So we have that connection between software engineering practices and research practices, and kind of building that bridge between those two groups. Generally speaking, RSEs support everything from individual lab groups or even individual researchers, all the way up to supporting departments or entire institutions, and in many cases, big and small interinstitutional collaborations, specifically thinking about like the open source scientific software space, and all of the RSE work that goes into that. RSEs generally are pretty formally organized. Well, maybe, yeah, I think that's true. Through like dozens of international, national, regional, and local associations and affinity groups and whatnot. So there are some of these major continent-wide or national US or RSE organizations, but there are also state level and local and institutional organizations that get together. So if you don't know if you have an RSE group near where you are, look around, you might be able to find one. And I think it's important to note that when we talk about research software engineers, there's a certain degree of overlap with a number of other types of job roles, right? So people generally who are using computational tools and methods in a professional capacity for research, I think kind of fall under a bigger umbrella that includes RSEs, but also people who do things like data science, people who just consider themselves computational researchers, like a computational microbiologist, for example, and so on. So these are all kind of what we mean when we say RSE. So to take the temperature of the room, we kind of have a mashup of approaches for this project. Most of this work was conducted at the kind of the last quarter of 2025. And these are the types of things that we did to take the temperature of the room. The first thing that we did, and maybe you've seen this or responded to it, is to send out a broad survey to our research software engineer networks that just asked a handful of pretty simple questions that we'll get to here in a second. And we got a number of responses back on that survey. And then the second kind of cluster of activity was to attend and run birds of a feather sessions or breakout groups at a number of RSE focused or RSE heavy conferences. So we attended SciPy, which is a scientific Python conference, RSECon, which is in the UK, US-RSE conference, which is in Philadelphia this or last year, and then Supercomputing 2025, which is down in St. Louis. So kind of tried to spread ourselves across the RSE space on short notice and get some groups together. And like I said, at those gatherings, we had some focus groups or birds of a feather sessions with a fairly open discussion format, asking a few questions that we'll see here in a second. So the results I'm going to show you from this work, I've got some numbers and graphs and stuff that come from our survey, but I'm also sort of trying to fold in all of this information from these birds of a feather sessions, which are really just discussion. And so what you'll see is a mashup of all of the information that we were gathering through this project. So the first I want to note just what the questions were. So real simple, we asked people what their work role was. So we wanted to know if they were an RSE or if they weren't, and they were responding, we wanted to know what they called themselves because we want to see what that overlap into other workspaces looks like. We wanted to know if people are using generative AI at work and what that looks like for them. These are all free text fields. What are some of the upsides? What are some of the downsides? Any other considerations we might want to take into account? And then what might help? What resources or activities or advocacy might help RSEs navigate the generative AI uh, push into the workplace. So from the general survey, we got about 125 responses. And you can see the results of the job categories over there on the right-hand side. Um, and then from the gatherings, we had maybe 200 folks show up to in total across all four of those. So we have a pretty good group of folks here. The majority of the people who we interacted with in the survey and in these gatherings consider themselves to be curious but cautious about AI for research software engineering. Um, and I think, as I noted earlier, we've got quite a few people who consider themselves research software engineers in the data here. But we also have a lot of folks who they consider themselves research scientists, or they're a manager of a unit, or they're a postdoctoral researcher, or simply they're an academic faculty member, but they identify as a research software engineer. I think that just really high level overall, what we're seeing is a community of folks who are super engaged with AI in their work, but deeply ambivalent about what role AI will play in their work in the future, how it's going now, and the impacts that it may have on things like workforce and so on. So just real quick, I'm just going to run through some summaries of the results that we from those questions on the survey and in the gatherings. How are RSEs using generative AI? Um, so this quote I really like on the right side here. Somebody referred to generative AI as a computationally expensive rubber duck. If you're familiar with the rubber duck method, which I found cute, but maybe not untrue. So the way folks are using generative AI is kind of listed here, right? So a lot of folks are using AI to clarify language and tasks. So doing things like breaking down problem tickets or clarifying documentation. Obviously, writing code and code suggestions. I think those are pretty self-evident uses. Project scaffolding, so structuring workflows or standing up repositories more quickly. Another very common use. And then reference, right? So somebody referred to this as Stack Overflow plus plus, which I think we see a lot of, is just sort of using generative AI as a reference. So that's kind of where things are in the workplace right now. What are the upsides folks report? Three upsides that I think are fairly self-evident. I think that we kind of expect these and we hear conversation about them. Is some efficiency gains people are seeing or believe they're seeing. Um, Upsides for code generation and debugging and troubleshooting. There are a few other maybe less evident upsides that we hear from folks. There were quite a few people who reported using generative AI for research support. So as an RSE, not using the AI for software engineering, but sort of the research aspect of the overall work that one does. Um, Early development and prototyping came up quite often. So moving quickly from an idea to code, especially when in like early conversations with someone that you're consulting with on a project. And then, of course, using the AI for learning and exploration. So training support and reference and so on. The downsides, a lot of concerns here. And I'll just list some basic categories. So, first, legal and ethical risks, right? So there are a lot of concerns that people have about privacy, implications for liability, and what the misuse of AI or AI augmented products or outputs means for the research software engineer or the organization itself. Concerns about licensing and IP. I think especially we hear a lot of concerns around ownership of AI generated or augmented products. So if I use generative AI for producing code, does that do something to the ownership of the code that I've produced, or does ownership remain with me? And then also a lot of concern about misuse of licensed materials when training these models. There's been a lot of discussion out there about that. Trust and reliability really drives at the heart of reproducibility in our research landscape. Transparency or lack thereof with these models drives at the heart of explainability of the research that we do. Um, quite a bit of concern about workforce deskilling. So thinking about early career research software engineer positions maybe going away with an assumption that generative AI can kind of take over that role, and then what that does to the pipeline, the sort of career trajectory of research software engineers. Um, and then I think that there's a fair bit of concern about unrealistic expectations, and I think that that speaks to the question, who is part of the discussion when we're on our campus or at our organization talking about using generative AI. Um, if we don't have people who are on the ground doing the work with generative AI, like research software engineers, if those people aren't part of the discussion, we may find ourselves in a position where management or administrators may have unrealistic expectations. So we have some concerns about that. Other general considerations. I just wanted to pull this one quote out, not because I necessarily think that it's right on, but because I think that it says something about the atmosphere that RSEs are working in right now around AI, right? So this quote says, generative AI technology is being pushed hard in all workspaces because of its potential for cost savings. It's paramount to remember that when discussing AI among peers, this is about saving costs. It's not about getting more accurate results or improving the workers day to day, and so on, right? So whether that's true or not, I think that it tells us something about um, the vibes, the atmosphere among RSEs, and kind of concern about a mismatch between the expectations around what AI can do and how we're uh, pushing to implement. Ultimately, what we want to sort out from this survey is what might help, right? So, what can the RSE community do to pull together resources to assist with navigating these waters? And from these discussions and from the survey, we sort of have this like whole swath of recommendations from RSEs who met with us, and I'll just go over some basic kind of categories here. So folks are looking for organizational guidance. We're finding that there's not a lot of guidance that institutions, so universities or national labs, are giving to researchers and RSEs specifically about how to use AI or not. A lot of times this is kind of left up to the researchers, um, which is good in some ways, but at the same time, a little bit of guidance would probably be helpful. So advocating for organizational guidance or helping create organizational guidance. Informational webinars is something we hear all the time. Everybody's doing informational webinars, but this specifically, I think, drives at this idea that there are a lot of folks in the RSE community using generative AI on a daily basis, and not a lot of venues in which to share what that daily use of generative AI looks like, right? So some informational webinars about like people's actual experiences with AI. There's the idea of an RSE playbook, so sort of a living guide of good and bad examples, of failure museum. So kind of having a space where RSEs can go to look at how people are using AI and how that's going and how that's been changing over time. Um, AI provenance templates to, for example, add to repository folders to document prompts. Um, Seeds, model versions, and rationale, and so on. So how we'll be using AI for this project. Oops. There's some discussion about training tracks, so gathering people together to do training, or focusing workshops around specific topics and offering those up to RSEs. Um, Community forums comes up repeatedly. We have a number of RSE community forums, but it seems like maybe there's a need not necessarily for a new community forum, but a focus in some of the forums that we have around the use of AI. Um, and then policy alignment. So this kind of comes back to that question of uh, institutional guidance, but sort of thinking about how the guidance coming from our institutions aligns with the guidance coming from our funding agencies and so on. So are those aligned? Where there's misalignment, what do we need to do or think about? Um, and I don't think I missed any. Great. Um, so we're kind of at the stage now. We're done collecting data. We're still hearing from people on our survey and in other venues, but we're kind of wrapping things up because I think that what we're finding and what we found towards the end of our, the last of our gatherings for this project was that we're really hearing a lot of the same information, right? People kind of are all like there's a sense that we're all kind of merging to the same set of needs here. Our research software engineers are merging to the same set of needs, and so I think that from the perspective of the project that we're working on, it feels like it's time to move from collecting information to trying to do things to help. So sort of implementing some of these ideas and recommendations, trying to convert high-level recommendations into durable community-facing resources um, for and by the RSE community. We think that RSE communities, as they are now, are well suited for this effort. This is a group of people or a set of groups of people who are super communicative and grassroots and supportive. And so I think that the RSE community is kind of primed to stand up some of these resources. And I think that a lot of this work is probably going to have to be somewhat local or regional or even continental, but that there are those geographic differences in workplace across the globe that we'll have to pay attention to. That said, probably not easy, probably a good idea to coordinate and so that we're not duplicating efforts. And then I think last and really important is to extend this kind of support and these resources out into these RSE-ish communities. So areas where people who are not don't self-identify as RSEs are doing RSE-like work, and may also be in need of these types of support resources. I want to call out just a couple of things that we're already doing or moving towards implementing. The first is that out of the RSECon session came the sort of emerged this position statement on generative AI and the RSE workplace. There's a link to it there and a QR code, and you'll have access to this on the slides too. But we're at this point taking signatures to this position statement, and you can find out how to do that at the link. But this statement was generated based on the content from all of our gatherings and survey, and then kind of iterated on by a number of the organizers of our session at RSECon. So please do take a look at that and sign if you feel like it rings true for you. We also think that there's some like low-hanging fruit that we could probably start working on right now. The speaker series or like AI office hours. How do we start talking to each other about how we're using AI? The notion of a council for tracking, so trying to understand how things change over time with these tools. What tools are relevant or important to RSEs and which ones are less so. So some way, a body of people to track that. We talked about AI policy and alignment templates, and then generally just sort of community building, continuing the community building that RSE communities already do, focused around use of AI in the workplace. Um, I'm happy to take questions here. I think I'm out of time here, but take questions here or online if you have them. Thanks.
Yeah, let's do one question now while Elle gets set up. And if you have more questions, you could type them into the chat or save them for the end of the hour.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That was great.
Sure. I see one
Yeah,
question.
go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is just a question. I really appreciate this study. It's very helpful. I wondered if you saw any difference in your responses based on the demographics of the person in the survey. In other words, particularly senior versus early career, whether their views were substantially different.
Yeah, I suspect that Elle's going to get to some of that. We didn't specifically ask that early late career question. We do think we saw some trends among people. One of the questions that I didn't mention that we asked was sort of approximately what percentage of your time do you spend writing software in your job? And so people who spend 75% or more, a lot of the feedback that we received here kind of comes from that cohort, and folks who were in management positions or administrative positions who were responding tended to have kind of a different take on some of these questions. And so I don't think that there was anything super divergent in that management versus non-management space, but I think there may be
Thank you.
more to investigate there.
Yeah, and just a very quick follow-on to that. The organizational, the readiness to take on and receive some guidance on organizational change, that would seem to be dependent on, at least partially, on how roles might be changing or what new roles might be emerging versus old roles. And do you feel that you got any inkling into that from the survey on what people were?
Yeah, I don't think we saw any inkling of that from the survey itself
Okay.
necessarily, but I do think that the RC community, the data science community, these communities of people who are in what many would consider to be new or new-ish types of roles in an academic setting or a research setting. These communities are already kind of used to maybe people having some difficulty understanding what the role of an RSE is. And so I think that experience may translate well to these AI spaces too, kind of explaining the role and helping
Okay.
people understand where it fits in the research process.
Thank you. This was really helpful.
Thanks for your question. Please feel free to keep typing them into the chat, and Elle will take it away now.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Quick about me. I did a PhD. I'm a computational scientist by training. Then I worked as an open source advocate for a little bit, and now I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of Michigan. And so I have started up a research program over the last few years studying scientists who code and now how that's being impacted with generative AI. And the work I'm about to show you is thanks to generous funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So it's also, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators here, Jeff Carver, Alexis Parker, and Nasir Isti, who have been pretty instrumental for all the work I'm about to show you. So I conducted another survey recently. This went out last August, and the target was any scientist who programs as part of their research. And we wanted to learn a bit about, what experiences are they having with generative AI tools specifically for programming? We're really only focused on research programming, not other uses of AI in their jobs. And so we're looking at, what's changing with AI tools being used, which tools are they using? And we also had a hypothesis we were trying to test about what drives perceived productivity. So we're going to report all of that. One thing I want to make really clear, we actually had a pretty low number of respondents who indicated that they self-identify as an RSE as their job title. We had a lot of people who are research staff. We have a lot of people who are faculty or graduate students, but not a ton of people who identified themselves said, my job title is RSE. So we have pretty high variance, and we have, maybe it's better to understand in terms of what programming practices people do on a daily basis. That may be a better index of how close they are to, the work of research software engineering. Because if we actually circulated this in like the US-RSE newsletter and Slack, it got pretty good engagement from looking at the timestamps of the responses relative to when I posted. But just a caveat that I'm pretty confident this survey skews generally more towards scientists who program than it does professional software developers who work in scientific contexts. So quick overview, the majority of the plurality of our respondents, the biggest category of where people are coming from is life sciences. We've also got heavy representation of engineering, social sciences, physical sciences. The sample is highly academic, so most people are working at a university, mostly US, and many are early career. We have a lot of people who have been in research for less than 10 years, and we have a lot of graduate students as well. So asking people, how often do you use any generative AI tool for their research-related coding? We find that there's quite a lot of experimentation happening. I would say adoption is common, but far from total. Kind of similar to the number that Steve found, there's maybe like a quarter, like 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 are not really using any generative AI tool at all. But the majority of people have at least tried and experimented at this point. So drilling down a little deeper into this, There are definitely field level differences. So when we break this up by field and we look at people's self-reported usage frequency, we're seeing that computer and information services has, the most highest proportion of regular users. With that said, remember that life sciences has the absolute greatest number of people who are responding that they to the survey. So there's a lot of people who are in this bucket of being like a life scientist who uses generative AI sometimes in their programming. There's also a significant difference by their job title. So we see that we have, a lot of student research assistants who are using this regularly. And we also see, if we look at years of programming experience versus usage frequency, that relationship is also significant. More junior programmers tend to use these tools more. Research software engineers, so people who did select this job title, actually have the lowest rates of adoption of anyone else. And we also have relatively lower with faculty too. So there does seem to be a relationship that the more experience people have in software development skills and programming, the less likely they tend to be regularly using one of these tools. Another fairly striking finding is that the primary tool for the people that are using this at least some of the time is ChatGPT. And so when I break this down into tools that are developer tools, so that would be something like, I'm considering GitHub Copilot a developer tool because of its integrated into your IDE. Claude Code, I would say, is a developer tool. So breaking those down into those categories versus things that are just a general purpose chat conversational agent. So I don't want to say agent there, but a conversational interface. So ChatGPT or Claude, right? That is much more common. And there are differences in the tool choice related to programming experience. So the more programming experience you have, the more likely you are to use a developer tool. Men are more likely than anyone else to use developer tools, and also field computer science tends to have the highest usage of developer tools. So the next thing I want to show you is kind of a hypothesis-driven part of this. So there was a study that came out by the GitHub Copilot team where they did a survey, but they cross-referenced with user logs, and they were looking at what are the drivers of perceived productivity with GitHub Copilot among some early users. And they found that relatively less experienced programmers tend to report the most productivity gains subjectively. And the biggest objective predictor, looking at their activity of what predicts, feeling productive, is accepting a lot of lines of code. So accepting, not a lot of lines, but like accepting many suggestions. So I was curious if we see any signs of similar relationships in this group, especially because they're using fairly different tools. We are seeing a lot of ChatGPT use, not Copilot. Copilot is something that is auto-completing for you versus ChatGPT is that, conversational agent, conversational, interface. So from that study, which was of GitHub Copilot users, we adapted their productivity scale. So measuring developer productivity is very hard. They have a method that's based on 5 factors, that we think theoretically are related to productivity in software development. So did some adapting so that the scale is applicable to, not just GitHub Copilot, but any tool that could be used for programming support. And I wanted to cross-reference this specifically with, I was really interested if in people's feelings of productivity are related to how many mature development practices they use. So I adapted a scale here. This is Jeff Carver and Nasir Isti had worked on this before. And so we took their scale from a previous study about the use of different development practices among, research software developers. And so we wanted to find out which ones are people familiar with and how often do they use them. And the hypothesis here is that I expect if you don't use code testing in any way, I think you are likely to feel more productive with whatever your GenAI tool is because you don't have a very regular set source of feedback. And I also would expect that, maybe something like code review, right? If you have code review, you're getting more feedback on your code and if it matches your assumptions and the specifications that it should be for the scientific problem you're solving. If you don't have that, I think you're likely to be, get less feedback about if the code is doing what you think it does. And I think that you are probably more likely to just say, looks good to me. I'm winning. I'm making so much code. So indeed, we find when we look at, taking the ratings of how familiar people are with the various practices and their like a composite score from the perceived productivity scale, basically every single practice, using it more is negatively associated with perceived productivity. So the less you use any of the development practices we surveyed, the more likely respondents were to report feeling very productive. And programming experience is also negatively associated with perceived productivity. So in our survey sample, the more experience someone has programming, the lower their perceived productivity gains are. That does not mean that people have like no perceived productivity gains if they're very experienced. People who use, one of these tools generally do report productivity gains with it. It's just moderated, right? It's just by how much. Are you saying this is a little helpful, medium helpful, or this is crazy helpful and suddenly I can do all these things that I never could before, and wow, it's just changed everything, right? So it's more about moderating the magnitude of that perception. And interestingly, we also see that there's an interaction between programming experience and their use of development practices here. So if we split up our data into people who have on the lower end of using any of the development practices we surveyed, there is this, we really see this relationship between programming experience and perceived productivity. So the more experience you have programming, the more, less perceived productivity you report. But in the group that uses a lot of development practices fairly regularly, we see a much flatter relationship. So I didn't really expect this to happen. My kind of looking at it backwards interpretation is that if you are in a setting, a group that uses some development practices, whether they be code review by a peer or you're testing, if you use those things, that gives you feedback that otherwise you might have to rely on, your own years of experience to kind of think about how are you going to inspect your code or your code base to make sure that it does what you think it does. I think that people who are experienced developers tend to have lots of informal, not systematic heuristics about how they do that. So that's my guess. Another interesting finding here is that there was this question, how many lines of generated code suggestions do you typically accept at one time when working with this tool? And this turned out to actually be the biggest single predictor of how productive people feel. The more lines of code you typically tend to report accepting, the more productive you feel. That is a bit concerning to me because of the more lines of code you accept, if you are trying to read those, which maybe not everybody is, but if you want to understand them, that's quite hard actually, right? The more code you have, the bigger the burden is to validate that it does what you think it does, whether it's by reading or some kind of like behavioral testing of it. And it's just, I was a little bit taken aback by this, but that's my editorializing. Perhaps there's another explanation for that. So basically, to summarize this here, perceived productivity with a code LLM is inversely related to experience and using software development practices, but this is not a causal experimental design. I do not know that if we actually taught people how to use more of these development practices, that they would suddenly moderate their perceptions of productivity. It could be that beginners really, truly are accurately gauging, the benefits that they're getting. I cannot rule that out. Finally, just checking the time. Yeah, I'll just real quick do this. We looked at why do people not adopt? So similar to Steve, we looked at, we asked people who are not using any of these tools, why not? And big reason we find is self-reliance. They're not wanting to impede their own learning. So a lot of people are afraid that if they do not go through, the experience of coding without an AI tool, they will, delay the development of their own programming skills. A lot of ethical concerns, and those range across, this is a really coarse encapsulation of a lot of distinct ethical concerns. So I can't do justice to this right here in just this figure. Another reason is just some people saying, I don't think my code is complex enough to warrant this. Some people are saying, I tried it and I was not more efficient with this. This was actually a time sink for me. And remember, I mean, a lot of people, any time that you're going to invest in practicing or exploring a new tool is time that you are not making a paper potentially. And since this audience is people who are probably not judged in their careers for on average, right? For our typical respondent, they're typically judged more on papers than they are on code, right? So I do think there is a real burden for people to explore these tools if they don't see some immediate benefit. And then there are also concerns about accuracy that some people were saying they did not feel that they were getting, reliable or correct, information or generations out of the tool. So quickly to review, adoption skews junior. The modal scientist who responded to this survey is using ChatGPT. They're probably not using a dedicated developer tooling that has AI in it. And perceived productivity appears to index heavily on generating code, and so the producing parts, and not all the other parts of the software development process, right? So the work besides writing the code feels like it is not, it's not well represented in what people are, reporting about their productivity. So we have a preprint that goes into a lot more details, and we have a lot more like cross tabs and different splits of the data by different factors if you're curious. And this just went up right before Christmas, and now I would love to take some questions.
Thank you, Elle. Feel free to type into the chat or raise your hand. And yes, let's start with a question specifically for Elle, and then we can open it up to Steve as well.
Hi, I put this one in the chat, but I can ask as well. So I didn't see a lot in the study about quality. And, one of the things that, of course, is hard to assess is the quality of generated code. But it seemed that with the experience anti-correlation, and the use of other tools, meaning test regression suites, code reviewing, things like that, that there's kind of that bias there as well. So what's your thought around quality in the survey?
Yeah, so essentially we don't have any access to that. So we kind of made a decision here that in order to get a lot of information about people's perceived productivity and to make it, scalable so we could collect, a really varied sample so we could look at what factors are related to it. That means that we are throwing out any attempt to objectively address the quality of the code that is being generated. And I'm honestly not even really sure how to address it because of, for a lot of people, because of they work on such varied and different code bases, I'm not sure what metrics we could use to get at that, but I'm really interested in that question. So, I mean, if anybody has any ideas of how we could actually start assessing quality of code that's been generated, and obviously that has many dimensions, right? I'm quite interested in that. Maybe that has to be done through case studies, not through a survey like this.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And, maybe the correlation is with using other development practices that are meant to be quality focused, right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that none of the particular test things that we looked at, like, it's kind of just a big amorphous blob of things that are correlated. Like, if one of these things in particular was like really the driver, like if it was code testing that was doing it, we'd probably see a really big correlation between that, right, and some of the variables that we're looking at. But it's kind of just a blob of all of these development practices. So it's kind of a non-specific effect. That could be because of we have fairly, limited statistical power here, but I do think that this is, I think it's kind of non-specific. It's just general attention to code and investment in, quality assurance about the code is, I think, what's probably my best guess is what's going on here, rather than any specific practice. But again, I think a lot more work is needed there because this is fairly high level.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to jump in while you're on the slide and say that I thought this comparison was very interesting to me that you were able to quantify that more experienced programmers use it less. Because based on my own anecdotal experience with developers I work with, the more experienced developers become, they tend to be very, their scope of how they want to write is becomes more narrow. They have their own voice. And I find that they are more resistant to what generative AI suggests only because it's not the same mental model that they've already established. And I kind of, for me professionally, I think that's a shame because it's a good opportunity to learn different ways to look at your code and to become more expansive as an engineer rather than saying, no, I don't like how you're saying this. It doesn't jive with me, so I'm not going to use you. Just seems like a missed opportunity that is being highlighted here. It shouldn't
Yeah,
just be for juniors. It's like as someone who's been doing this, like I am just ah, I want to do so many things right now. This is so exciting. This is my first not work related call I've even joined because I'm so excited about this stuff. So
yeah, I think there's quite a lot going on. Like I said, it's a non-zero time investment to pick up any of these. I feel constantly overwhelmed by things that I should learn versus not. Another thing is that the tools do change quite a bit, and if I think there are some findings that for a lot of people, right? So understanding how an LLM behaves is you have to establish a distribution of its behaviors, right? Because of its stochastic and it's also highly sensitive to the parameters that you give it in your prompt. So a lot of people tend to kind of go in, they try it a couple times, and then they don't really query the distribution. They just sort of get a point estimate and then fixate on that. And the tools, there's a huge landscape of tools. And so one thing I've really caught in myself is that I will say, like, my initial experiences with ChatGPT is I don't want to use this for development, but that doesn't mean there are no tools that have an LLM component in them, right, that are useful for development. But doing that, right, so exploring that space, it requires effort. And it, yeah, it's not easy to do, at least for me.
Yeah, I think, and that's why that is one of the potential support things that was identified through our work is kind of, is there a way for the community as a whole to track these major changes, or as a subgroup of the community to track those changes, rather than everybody individually trying to like scramble around and spend all the resources figuring it out.
Pavan has a question in the chat about like modality sort of for RSEs and researchers or in academia, people using AI in a command line interface or in a local system. Would that change anything about the perception or usage?
Okay, so I have a couple thoughts about this. A couple months back, I thought absolutely yes, because of Copilot is what's it like something like Copilot tends to give you fewer lines of code at once than ChatGPT. ChatGPT is like no guardrails at all of like you want 10,000 lines of code? Yeah, I'll give it to you, right? You can put anything that fits in the context window, it's going to try, and it has some sycophancy built in. So it won't usually tell you I don't do that. Versus something like Copilot, the interface restrains what you can ask it for, what you can do. And I don't, so I did think that, if we got people using something like Copilot, that might help moderate some of the most extreme behaviors that I've seen in some of my other interview studies with ChatGPT. But there's also this rise of fully agentic things and like, Cursor, which I've been experimenting with. And something for me that is so overwhelming about it, which I'm not saying judgmentally, I'm not sure how to handle this, is that the size of the PRs, like the diffs it will create, are just so huge. It will produce so much code that I can't possibly evaluate it. And yet I know that there are professional developers who are using this and who are reporting that, they're finding it to be helpful. And I suspect that's because if they have a really good test harness set up, but I'm not sure. So I find myself maybe even a little more confused than ever about which tools are likely to, just, yeah, the modalities and the kind of the modes they throw you into as a user feels maybe more varied than ever. And so I'm less sure than ever. Oh, there is a question here. Did you get a sense about people's perceived productivity correlating with tools? Matt, I did run this and I did not see a difference in perceived productivity by the tool. It looks much more related to their usage, like because some people are using ChatGPT in a way of like they never use it to generate code, directly. They're just using it to like tell me what's the, the method in this library for this API call, right? So I think we'd have to break it down much further. I think those actual, like how much code are you accepting or how, that seems to be more related to your perception of productivity than specifically which tool you're using.
We have time for another question if anyone would like to pose one here in the chat.
I just had
Yeah,
a
go ahead.
comment I can throw out there if you don't mind. So experienced professional software engineer here. Anecdotally, I think I feel most productive or my productivity is most increased when the kind of work I'm doing is working in a language or framework that I don't have experience with yet. And the chatbots, the code assistants, however I have it set up, can sufficiently bootstrap me such that I can pretend like I've been using the language or framework for years on end. But if I'm working in languages and frameworks that I'm very familiar with, often I just get aggravated at the AI assistant because they're stupid, to put it bluntly.
So that's actually something I'm curious, Steve, if you saw this, but in a previous interview study that I did with scientists, kind of the dominant use case that came up was a lot of people have needs to work in more than one language when they're a scientific software developer. And that includes translating code bases left behind by a postdoc. You switch labs and now you have to work in another language. And so I kind of think like one of the best possible use cases for this technology is that it is highly needed and it lends itself naturally in some cases to having, clear benchmarks for if you succeeded in the translation.
Yeah, we heard a little bit of that in our discussions. I think it's not uncommon, and especially with older, research models and stuff like that, kind of thinking about how to update, translate.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Steve and Elle, for these presentations. Thanks for everyone with your questions and conversation in the chat. I'm really happy you all joined us today, and I'd encourage you to come for more discussion on AI tooling for our next webinar in March. And also look for an invitation to join this conversation. We'll have a more informal discussion group that I'd love to hear from people from. I'm personally super curious about the self-reliance aspect of this and what that might mean for science versus industry. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. This has been great. I'll post the recording online soon. And I hope you have a great day.